Hello everyone and welcome to the very first lesson on our course. Today we're going to talk about the messaging system between banks. We will get introduced to Swift and ISO as well. Banks all over the world, they need to communicate in order to have cross-border transactions. Long time ago, banks used to use fax or even phone calls to communicate between each other, but this way was not secured at all, and at the same time it consumes a lot of time. And here we go. That's why we have Swift. A group of business tycoons in Belgium decided to establish a network that connects banks all over the world. Swift stands for Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunications. And the network we mentioned about is called SwiftNet. So now we have the network, but as a bank, how can I identify other banks in order to send them messages? And here comes the role of the BIC. The BIC stands for Business Identifier Code, not Bank Identifier Code. And it can act as a national ID for each bank and also for each branch. We will explain this in the coming example. Okay, so the BIC is divided into 4 parts. The first part is going to be the bank code, second part is the country code, third part is location code, and fourth part is the branch code. As you can see, the formats, the first part is 4 letters, and then 2 letters, then 2 letters or numbers, and then 3 digits. We will have an example right now. That's the BIC of ABB Capital Bank in Switzerland. So as you can see, the first 4 letters are ABB Capital. This stands for the bank. And then CH, this is Switzerland. And ZA is the location code or the city. This is Zurich. And then 147, this is the branch number. That's easy. Now we know Swift and its relation to the bank messaging system, but what is ISO? And why we always hear about ISO 150.2.2 or ISO 200.2.2? Well, ISO is an organization that describes the best way of doing anything. They actually put standards in order to make anything in the optimum way. Still, where is the relation between ISO and the banking systems? When Swift created their own network and identified banks throughout the BICs, they thought like, okay, now we have the network, we have the parties that will send to each other on this network, but we still need a standard or a format for these messages in order to guarantee an optimum way of communication between banks. And that's why we have the cooperation between ISO and Swift. There are 2 very common Swift messages format. The first one is the empty, and also we can call it ISO 150.2.2. And the second one is the MX, and this is the latest one. We call it as well ISO 200.2.2. So let's take a look into the ISO 150.2.2 structure or the empty structure. This is how the empty message looks like, and it's made of 5 blocks. Block number 1, this is the basic header. Block number 2, this is the application header. Block number 3, this is the user header. And block number 4, and that's the most important one that contains all details in this message, it's called text. And the very last block is called trailer. Sounds easy, but let's talk about each block specifically. Block number 1, or the basic header, and that's the only obligatory block within a Swift message. It contains the fundamental details that identify the message, such as who is the sender bank, who is the receiver bank, and so on. Block number 2, 3, and 5, I would prefer I explain them on a real example so that you can understand their details, because I can tell you now that block number 2 has information that is specific to the application. You can't understand what this is. However, this means that in block number 2, you can find, let's say, the message name and type. Later on, we will explain that each message has a name, like the MT103, the very famous one. So this 103, you can find it in block number 2. You can find as well if the message is an incoming or an outgoing message. Block number 3, I can tell you that it can only be assigned by the sender, but you don't know the content of this block. And block number 5 as well, I can tell you it includes security details associated with the message. So it's better to explain those 3 blocks when it comes to a real-life example. But block number 4, as I mentioned before, it's the most essential one. It has all details, the amount of the transaction, the currency of this transaction, the date, who is the debtor, who is the creditor, and the bank of this debtor and the bank of this creditor. And if we have intermediary banks, it's a very long story. We will talk about all of its details later on. The empty messages are divided into 9 categories. And the most important categories are category 1, that's the customer payments and checks. Category 2 is financial institution transfers. And category 9, cash management and customer status. For example, in category 1, we have the very famous message that is called MT103. We can use it as an example to explain the naming of these messages. So the first part is the MT, which refers to the format of this message. And then we have here the first character, which stands for the category. So 103 refers to category 1. And 0 here stands for the group, or the second character stands for the group. If it's 0, this means that this message is an electronic message. If 1, this means it's a paper-based message. But nobody's using the paper-based nowadays. And the last character stands for the type, or the number of this message in the category. From Swift's point of view, now we have the network. We have the banks that will connect on this network. We can identify them using the BICs. And we have the format of messages that they will send to each other. But still, there is something missing. There is a chance that a bank send a false message to another bank, or even a bank can send a message without an amount or without a currency. That's why Swift needs a sort of rules or validations or even checks that should be made on each message before its launch. And that's why Swift has 4 levels of validation. The first level is the empty network validation rules, or the NVR. Each error has its own error code defined in Swift website. And it does validation on the major things, on the important parts. So let's say Bank A wants to send a message. In block 4, it has a tag called 55A. So if this 55A present, then both field 53A and field 54A must present in this message. So as we can see here, if 55A present, then 53A and 54A are mandatories. If it doesn't present, then they are optionals. The second level of validation is the empty usage. The difference here is that this check is not made on the network. And that's different from the NVR. The NVR is made on the network, but the empty usage rules are not checked on the network. But still, they are super essential to utilize the message correctly. Let's take an example for the usage rules. Here we have the MT103, the famous message I mentioned about. And in this MT103, it has a field called field 20. It has the reference number of this message. Each message on the network will have its own reference number. We can consider it as the national ID per message. So the reference number for MT103 is present in the field 20. And when a bank sends an MT103 to another bank, this first bank should as well send a message called MT202 a sort of confirmation for the payment that happened with the MT103 or the settlement. Anyway, these two messages are connected to each other. So whenever a bank sends the 103, should send as well 202 code. But this 202 code, how to make it related to this 103? So let's say the bank send every day like 100 MT103s and 100 MT202 code. How to know which MT202 code is related to which MT103 is throughout field 20 and field 21. Field 20, as we said, in the MT103 has the reference number. MT202 code has also its own field 20 that has its own reference number, but we don't need it in this example. But in field 21 in MT202 code, we take this reference number and put it here. And this field is called the related reference number. Means that it has the reference number of the related message to this MT202 code. And here comes the usage rule. It says that in each MT202 code, field 21 should be identical to field 20 in its MT103. The third and the fourth level of validation, they are super simple and we can talk about them when it comes to real-life example. But briefly, we can say that the guidelines, they are not required for using the message correctly, but they are just mainly related to the best practices. And the same thing as well to the market practice rule. For example, the PMPG, it's a market practice guidelines for use of the MT202 code. And here comes a very essential concept in the banking system. It's the correspondent banks. Let's imagine that we have two payment systems. The first one is a euro payment system. The second one is a US dollar payment system. And we have a bank A in the euro and bank B in the USD. Bank A wants to have a USD account and bank B wants to have a euro account. So what do? They become customers to each other. To make it simple, let's talk about the account that bank A will open at bank B. So bank A opens a USD account at bank B, and this account can have one of two names, either a nostro or a vostro. What are the differences, or it depends on what to call this account, a nostro or a vostro. So if bank A is mentioning about this account, it will say that it's the nostro account because it's the account of bank A. But this account, bank B will call it the vostro account. Again, so bank A will say that it's my nostro account at bank B, and bank B will say it's the vostro account of bank A at my bank. It's a bit confusing, but by time you will find that it's super easy. And also bank B can do the same thing at bank A. And in this case, we can say that both banks are correspondent to each other. But still, to be correspondent to each other doesn't mean that bank B should open an account at bank A and bank A should open an account to bank B. This bilateral relation is not a must. So bank A doesn't have to open an account so that we can call them correspondents. So simply, one account is enough to call them correspondent. So when bank A opens an account at bank B and they are correspondent, and then bank A opens an account in bank C, they become also correspondents, and D and E and F and tons of banks, bank A will face a lot of problems related to how to manage these relationships with tons of banks. So here comes the RMA. The RMA, or the Relationship Management Application, it allows any bank to control which correspondent can send a SWIFT message to it. By the end of this lesson, I have introduced to you By the end of this lesson, I can say that now you have some basics and fundamentals pertinent to the messaging systems of banks. And if you have any question, you can send me an email or leave a comment.